Misha here, and for a little bit, I've really felt like revisiting British submachine guns. They're pretty iconic, next to things like the Ep.III, the Thompson, the Papa Shaw maybe. The British Sten is one of the most famous submachine guns, certainly of World War II and beyond. In part one, we looked at its genesis with the British use of the Thompson, the creation and use of the Lanchester. Part two, we looked at the Sten Mark I, Mark II, and Mark III. That got us up to 1943. Really kind of both its high point and low point, depending on how you look at it. But now we're gonna turn that corner and look at the refined Sten, beginning with the Mark V here. Just as before, this is a legal semi-automatic, not a select fire gun, built by MK Gun Mods long ago, using original parts. At first, the Mark V might look pretty different, but the truth is, it's just a fresh coat of paint on a very, very familiar platform. However, it was the standard British submachine gun for well over a decade, and in some ways was a bit of a band-aid, in other ways quite a success. But it would ultimately lead to one of the best submachine guns in history, the Blaztec E11. Wait, that's not right. The L2A3, aka the Sterling Mark IV. And we began this series with a Sterling gun, so it seems fitting we'll end it with one. And unlike the previous guns, this is not a US build, this is a factory pre-ban from the 80s, and I did a video on it not all that long ago, but we'll touch upon it again in this video and get more into the history. It's ironically the one I don't have a display barrel for, even though these originally came with them. Of course, I bought it secondhand because when these were being imported, I was under 18, so yeah, cool gun though. And it would serve the Commonwealth through the Iraq War, Desert Storm, and beyond. And yeah, I would argue that it is one of the finest submachine guns ever created by man. Anywho, we'll get into it and how it connects to the Patchet and that evolution there. As always, if you could, please do like, share, subscribe. Like to help us out. Commenting is a great start. You can also do a super thanks, or you can go over and check us out on Patreon. And if you haven't, be sure to check out parts 1 and 2. Just hanging out while we still have nice weather and revisiting something that brings me a lot of joy. I love firearms history. So if you do too, well, pop me on here for a bit and we'll just hang out and kind of low-key chill. Plus, there might be a few surprises along the way. Context is king, so how did we get here? In the beginning, the British did not think much of submachine guns, but 1939 changed things. In 1940, they copied the German MP-28-2, the Bergmann, as the Lanchester Mark I, Mark I Star. Nice submachine gun, but it took 24 man-hours to produce. Wood, brass, bronze, a lot of machined parts. It could not be adequately scaled up for production, especially as Britain ends up on the back foot after Dunkirk, France falls, and they're an island alone throughout 1941. We ended up with the original Sten Mark I, which its earliest days was a simplified, a quote, improved Lanchester, but it quickly evolved into its own thing thanks to Shepard and Turpin at the Royal Arms Factory Enfield. Now, I don't have a Mark I or Mark I Star, You know, these videos are my collection. I don't have access to museums, sorry. But the Mark III is the ultimate statement of the Mark I. In fact, the company that made these Lyons Brothers helped Singer Sewing Machine as a subcontractor produce the original Mark I Star. And what kind of defined these was a fixed magwell, a single-piece receiver tube. With the Mark I, the barrel is removable. Mark III, it's just permanently in place. This gun, it started off taking 12 hours to build with the Mark I. By the time of the Mark III, we're right at 5 hours at its most refined. And these are created in 1942 and produced through 1943 as it happens. And really sets about mass production. They can make hundreds of these every shift at the Lyons Brothers factory in England, but they were never really produced outside of there. It was with the Mark II, whose origins go back to early 1941, to make essentially a takedown version for paratroopers and special forces. This is where the Sten made a name for itself. You know, they built almost 1 million Mark IIIs. They built well over 2.5 million, maybe even closer to 3 million if you count everything, including unofficial Mark IIs here. This is where the Sten really got it. Now, this took a little bit more time to make than a Mark III. 7-8 man-hours, I know. Still less than a Mark I. You could build 3 of these for the cost, even less than, of 1 Lanchester. Makes perfect sense. And the bones are here. The basic submachine gun. And this really was as basic as it gets. I didn't bring it out, but the T-stock, this is the loop stock, which a little bit more ergonomic. Also probably cheaper to make than the T-stock. Not as durable, but at least you have a stock shape. The tube stock, the T-stock, is just a strut. And I've showed it in the past video. I just didn't bring it up this time. Simple, fixed rear sight. Simple, blobbed on front. The original, of course, was open bolt select fire. This is a closed bolt semi-auto. This is a display barrel. Originally, these had about a 7.8-inch barrel. They were in 9x19, typically with a 2-groove barrel, and they fed from standard 32-round double-stack single-feed bags with the famous simplified trigger group. And of course, the Mark II was easily removed. All of the infields, pretty much you could pull the stock off by just pressing this button and pushing it down. But with the Mark II, you could unscrew this and remove your barrel to further compact things. And the magwell would go down like this for transport. Even the sling was quite simple. This one actually has a true piece of rotating metal, but we've seen some made that take a nail and just bend it. And then, of course, this is done so you could quickly and easily just hook it to whichever vent shroud is available, whichever hole on here, or as part of the takedown. Simple, elegant. Yeah, right. No, it worked, and it gave Britain the ability to pretty much make every man a machine gunner, submachine gunner, and a whim. And this is, you know, the Battle of Britain times. But then, of course, the U.S. enters the war. Now, it would take time. 1942, the Sten would see combat, not going much of anywhere. But by 43, there are plans, and things are changing. And then, of course, you have things like the Battle of Kursk in the east. And it's no longer a matter of if Germany will be defeated, but more how it's going to come about. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the war was won. I'm just saying the tide had turned. And while they may not have known how Germany was going to be defeated, it did not look like the Allies would be defeated. It was either a separate peace, a truce, ceasefire, or an outright defeat. Of course, you have things like Yalta happening, but with Russia starting to finally get their feet under them and holding their own in the east, and with the U.S. really getting trained up, and by this point the Pacific has simmered down for them. You see what I'm saying? And of course, things happen in North Africa. You have things happening in Italy, and obviously by 1943 they're already talking about what would become D-Day, the invasion in northern France. It would still take time to get the exact details, but they knew it was coming. In other words, they knew that their war would go from defensive to offensive fighting. They also knew that now they had plenty of submachine guns. The Mark.III, hundreds of thousands of those, not to mention the, a couple of 100,000 Mark I's, were enough for the home front, guards. Lanchesters were on board Royal Navy ships. It was the Mark.II that was being used in frontline combat units, also because it could be easily disassembled. They could drop these in behind the lines to help arm partisans in Europe, and heck, they could even use them as templates and make their own. That's the beauty of these guns, how simple they are. This is where the need for a more refined, more user-friendly, and frankly just better-looking Sten comes from. Because, look, the British had a long-standing tradition of firearms manufacturing that predates America as a nation. This gun was offensive to them, at least some of them, on a cosmetic, aesthetic level. But, needs must. The British are also good at that. But by 1943, the needs were changing. And we start to get feedback from soldiers that have been using these in the field for over a year. The Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield, a team is established there using soldier feedback to draw up plans for a new Sten version, new Sten variant, and at least the outlines are ready by December of that year. They had two options: base it on the Mark I/Mark III pattern, or base it on the Mark II pattern. Mark II easily won out. So this was going to be where they would start with their new design, new model. And it was hoped that these could supplement existing Stens in the front lines, combat units, obviously airborne assaults, that kind of thing, and to some extent supply allies, but a lot of times those would still get the older Stens, and they were not going to stop Mark II production. It would be concurrent because it's spread about everywhere, places like Canada and India and so on and so forth. But with that preamble out of the way, meet the Mark V. Yeah, Enfield would create this pattern, and by February of 1944, the first examples would be ready. And it looks like Enfield built the first 500 or so. Got them out in the field, kind of got the pattern out there. But then, because they had other things to do, production was transferred over to Fazekerli and Thiel. As far as I know, they were never made outside of the UK. Now, I know there's some Indian marked ones and certainly some Indian rebuilds and stuff and copies, but those aren't true Mark V's, I would say, but you can argue amongst yourselves. I think there are some Pakistani marked ones too, but what we think of as the Mark V was only done there. And enough of them were in the field by the time of D-Day, June 6th, that they did see combat there immediately thereafter. This is another, of course, MK Gun Mods semi-auto. Striker fired here. Boom. And this may look different from a Mark II at first, but it's really not. You have the same rotating magwell here, and it even uses the same, I just grabbed a random mag, double stack single feed magazine, and it has the same removable handguard / collar up here, and it even still has a 7.8 inch barrel. But here we have one of the first big differences. They took the front sight from a number 4 Mark 1 infield. So it is windage adjustable. Even the Mark 1 didn't have an adjustable sight, so this is kind of a first for the series. The rear sight is still just a fixed peep, but I would say it's applied more elegantly, less sloppy weld, just, a little more refined. So there you have it. The operating system, the bolt is the same. By this point, the style of bolt where you can push it in and lock it forward is a standard, not just with this Sten, but most of them. Even older ones are often retrofitted. You still have the J-hook in the back. No manual safety down here, but you still have a fire mode selector. On the semi-auto here, when it's in fire, well, it's fire, and then if you press it through, it effectively works as a safety. So cool to have a working safety, but also keep the original look and selector. Of course, one of the most eye-catching differences is the furniture, the return of wood, as it were. The Mark I had some wood. The Mark V restored it. We have a pistol grip, very vertical, but it's there. And because of this, we have to change our lower pack. This all is moved forward and adjusted a bit to make room for the grip, so it can still reach the trigger. So a Mark V lower is a different style. However, the stock might look very different, but it still attaches the exact same way as before. You just press in and then pull down. Slides down just as before and comes off. And to clear it, they had to put a little gap in the pistol grip here, which does give a weak spot, but it is still technically a takedown. And of course, you could absolutely fire it like this. Rather famously, at least originally, there were some wooden kind of stubby foregrips too, and they just bolted on to the shroud. In fact, probably using this hole right here, they didn't work out great. So I've seen reproductions. Every kit I've ever seen didn't have them. But let's talk about the stock. Have a nice metal connection point, strong, and we have a moving sling swivel, much wider than before. And as far as I know, even though I've seen them in different locations, the top is the correct spot, at least the normal. Flipping over, we have an actual butt plate and even a trapdoor. Yeah, this one's stiff too, like we saw on the Lanchester. Although it is a little smaller, the compartment isn't quite as large. But it's relatively decent wood, although Jay and I used to joke it looks like it came from someone's schiffer robe that was donated to the war effort. But hey, some wood is always better than no wood. This slides back on in place here. This one's a little stiff. There we go though. I don't want a wobbly stock anyway. And having the easily detached and retached sling for this style of Sten, it's a good thing. It is definitely a good thing. And I like how this does rotate, so it kind of prevents binding. A lot of thought went into this gun. And I should also mention the finish would change. With the previous Mark I, Mark II, Mark III, they typically used a chemical style of bluing. Different factories, different ways, black oxide. But with this one, they started using the rather famous Sunkerite black paint. Something that would become very, very common throughout the Commonwealth, really even to this day. Of course, we do have one other feature to mention at the muzzle. Just as the Mark V has a number 4 front sight, it also has lugs on the barrel to take a number 4 pattern of bayonet. Of course, in 1944, the spike bayonet was the norm, but that tent post well, it wasn't terribly useful on the rifle. And for the submachine gun, because these were intended for airborne commandos, not just frontline, but also they were intended for and often used in close quarter fighting, urban warfare, and even prisoner guards, because by this point, late 44 into 45, the Allies are going through France, retaking it, and then into Germany, crossing the Rhine, as it were. So, a new pattern of bayonet / knife was created just for this gun. January of 1945, we get number 7 Mark I Land Forces. Well, in this mode, fighting knife. Because the idea, you need a knife, but we want to keep the kit as simple and light as possible. So let's have something that can be used as an actual knife, unlike the number 4 spike bayonet. And then, here's the switch, could be made into a bayonet. In fact, this is often called the switch. And while this could absolutely fit the number 4 infield, it was approved for and intended for the Sten Mark V. Now, I've done a full video just talking about this interesting knife / bayonet, and I showed this gun in that. It has its own issues. It's not perfect. They didn't make a ton of these, as it would happen. And even though the whole switch system, it was more trouble than it was worth, this blade would continue on, even to this day, in Commonwealth. First was the number 9 bayonet, and then carrying over to the L1A1 and the Jungle Carbine, and even influencing later designs, and still in British service today. It's a good clip point, not too long, not too short design, and it connects directly with the Sten Mark V. I know bayonet videos aren't the biggest popular thing here, but if you're interested, yeah, search my channel for the number 7 Land Forces switch knife / bayonet. It's pretty cool. Sadly, we need to move on. As I said, Enfield made the first batch of Sten Mark V's, and then Fazakerley and Thiel would pick up the slack. Throughout 1944 and 45, maybe into 46, it's hard to say, but through 45, they would build about 525,000. Forgotten Weapons says 527,000, which is probably correct, including all of them. So the smallest number we've seen since the Mark I Star. Now you might be thinking, what about the Mark IV? It was an experimental version that never went anywhere, although some of its features and ideas would be rolled over into the Mark V. There was, of course, also the Mark III-S, the silence version. We mentioned it briefly last time. That's pretty famous with the suppressor integrated and the whole wrap thing. I think it's a really cool look for a semi-auto carbine. There you go. But I still prefer doing display barrels on these. And the Mark V was the standard frontline submachine gun of England in the last year of the war and throughout the 1940s. Now, it never fully replaced the Mark II because of its numbers, but it did allow them to officially declare the original Mark I obsolete in 1947. The Mark III would kind of go that way soon thereafter, meaning that you get basically the Mark II and the Mark V as the main guns. But going back to World War II, what did soldiers think of it? One thing, it inherited the exact same magazine as the previous Stens, which isn't the easiest to load and most reliable. Looked at it last time, but some, and especially in like desert environments later on, they would put brackets in, turning them effectively into single stack, single feed 20 rounders. Yeah, you reduce your ammo, but if you improve your reliability, sometimes it was worth it. Feeding devices aside, soldiers generally liked it. It was felt to have better ergonomics, obviously. I mean, you have an actual pistol grip, stock, cleaning kit, better sights with at least some adjustment, and a little bit, well, quite a bit better sight radius compared to the Mark II, and a little bit better than the Mark III. I mean, you have here to here, so that always helps. So practical accuracy went up, groupings went up, the grip. They were considered easier to use long term, in extended firefights or guard duties, patrols, easier to carry, especially with the sling that's kind of top mounted. You could just sling it over your... Yeah, soldiers generally liked them and approved of that. The Sunkerite finish was better at resisting rust, and basically more fit and finish, skilled labor, time was put into these, so that did correct some of the glitches that had appeared during the rush era of the trigger pack. You had less malfunctions of the switch and everything, and since the bolt had the forward safety as a standard feature now, that helped quite a bit. It didn't completely remove those issues, but then again, those aren't unique to the Sten. Submachine guns of that era just had those open bolts, but they did what they could, and it showed, and it was just a better looking gun. Again, the British had pride, and they were professional, modern military, so going into combat with something like the Mark II or even the Mark III wasn't really good. This one, it absolutely took inspiration from the Thompson. And that is a criticism. Some said they just kind of put lipstick on a pig. They took the Sten and tried to gussy it up externally, but inside it was the same gun, fair, but then again, it's a submachine gun. What can you really do? So some criticized it as just not enough, but it was much better and generally well liked. Again, it was used in urban fighting, close quarters into Germany, some little bit of kind of foxhole fighting, trench warfare, mobile type stuff. It was dropped in at D-Day and Arnhem and other places. The airborne seemed to like them. At least it gave the Brits something when the Americans came over with their new shiny guns to kind of be proud of. So, all in all, successful. And while it definitely took more man hours to create than the previous versions, it was still far less resource and time intensive to produce than the Lanchester, while giving basically the same features. I don't know how many man hours the Mark V was, but probably in the teens, 12 to 15. That's a complete guess that I pulled out of my rear, but it gives you an idea, because you do have to finish the wood and all that, and explains probably why a lot of this was done in-house. They didn't use a whole network of subcontractors like they did with the Mark II. It was more like the Mark I and the Mark III, and that it was mostly just made by a couple of companies with outsourcing things like the wood and then bringing it, say, to Forsakerly to be fitted and all that. Good enough gun, which explains why it was still the standard all the way until 1957 and would not be retired in a lot of areas in the UK until the 60s. But that said, there is still room for improvement, and a gentleman by the name of Patchett thought he had the answer. It should come as no surprise that I don't have a Patchett semi-automatic to show you either, although I think I've seen more kits of those, or at least talk of parts for them, than I have Sten Mark I's. So, brought back out the Lanchester because, well, they're both from Sterling Arms or Sterling Armament, and they kind of have similar stories. When the British were shopping for a submachine gun in 1940, well, work on this had already been underway for several months. Same thing kind of goes. In 1944, kind of an eye towards post-war and colonial operations, maybe things for UN, NATO. Of course, it's not created yet, but but they're looking for a peacetime submachine gun, and they do give some specifications eventually. For example, it needs to be chambered for 9mm. They want a rate of fire of 500, 550 rounds per minute, so a little slower than the Sten. They want it to have a certain accuracy standard they specify. They want it to be under 6 pounds. Obviously, safer, more reliable, things like that. As it happens, a gentleman by the name of George Patchett, who would become the chief engineer at Sterling. He started working there a few years earlier. Started developing his own submachine gun using a lot of parts from the Lanchester, because they're still making them, but they're wrapping things up. And he wants to make a gun that is more refined, safer, easier to control, especially on automatic fire, but still has an eye towards economy and scale, but definitely a nicer gun for the troops. So when the military kind of says they were looking for something new, already by February of 1944, he can show them some prototypes and designs and ideas, and this would result in them ordering 120 so-called Patchett Mark I machine carbines that year. And it's debated very heavily if any of them saw active combat in late 44, early 45. We do know that about 100 of the 120 ordered were given to airborne for testing and trials, but that's not to say they saw live combat. They might have gone over to Europe and been used in safe areas. We don't know. There's arguments for and against. Let's just say the original Patchet Mark I was definitely there in one way or another at the end of World War II. What was it? Well, it's a submachine gun. It kind of was like a Mark III Sten or a Lanchester type receiver, a little bit shortened and lightened. It used newer stamping technology more. It still used welds and stuff, but made them much nicer, cleaner. It had obviously not a traditional wood stock like this one. It had a pistol grip and folding stock, making it more controllable. Interestingly, in the beginning, the Patchett still took Sten mags because they had so many. So they did test them, evaluate them, and they decided that, it was improved over the Sten in pretty much every way that mattered. But after the war, they had literally millions of Stens, budget cuts. Basically, they decided a new machine gun was not a priority. And George Patchett took advantage of this. The Patchet Mark I achieved better reliability thanks to slightly redone bolt and a better fire control group than the Sten had. Of course, it had better sights, the pistol grip and folding stock were nice. It was better, safer. But since it was still leaning on the Sten mag, especially when it was mass-produced during the war, it inherited the harder loading of the single feed and, well, the issues with it. But with more times on his hands, in 1946, he introduced a whole new style, pattern of mag, and this very well could be the ultimate submachine gun feeding device. First, double stack, but now it's double feed as well, like a Uzi, a Thompson. Better reliability and much easier to load. And if that's not good enough, instead of just a traditional follower, it has not one but two rollers in here. So as you push it down, it rolls against the side of the magazine. Oh, it's just nice. It kind of reminds me of like a drum, how they have like fake cartridges in there to help feed. Oh, it's in there too. And to better improve feeding, it is a curved mag, not straight. That also means it doesn't stick out quite as far as a Sten, and you get a couple of extra cartridges, so more ammo and just a little less protrusion. And you notice it's got the ribbing here, the way it's put together. Even kind of has some protection on the front, so if it gets knocked, it'll dent this as opposed to in there. Whereas on the Sten, that was one issue because, again, with it sticking out of the gun, this could bang against it. I mean, look at the other video where I knocked the camera over. I mean, so that's kind of a bit of a guard. Now, even the spring, to keep it from sticking to the sides, is a round spring. I mean, it's a very well thought out mag. And while they're not super expensive to produce, They are nowhere near as cheap as a Sten mag. So there's that. And to work with the new mag, he had to change the mag well on the submachine gun itself. Like the Sten, the Sterling essentially has a 90-degree, just straight out, perpendicular mag well. For feeding and safety and everything else, the way this mag is, he had to angle it forward to about 82 degrees. And this would result, along with a few other small changes, in the Patchet Mark II. And it was just in time for another round of trials in 1947, really the first ones of note post-war, and the Patchet Mark II, possibly some older Mark Is that were just around, would go up against a few other designs. I think BSA put in one, Enfield put in one. I think they even tested an Aussie gun. And of course they used the Sten Mark V, which was at the time the standard submachine gun, as the control. And they were looking for the exact things you'd expect: reliability, durability, safety. And they did a lot of like drop tests and shock tests. They really wanted to see if the new magazine was feeding better compared to the old ones. You know, accuracy, especially in fully automatic, if it mattered. And of course, they looked at the economics too. They took soldiers' feedback into account. And officially, these trials were inconclusive. Unofficially, the Patchet pretty much wiped the mat with the best that Sten could offer, the Mark V. Now look, it's a perfectly good gun, and the Sten was exactly the gun that Britain needed in 1941. If the Patchet had been available, it wouldn't have been. I mean, look at the Lanchester. But in 1947-48, things were changed. Now, the budget was still pretty tight and would remain so for another couple of years. So I think one reason there was no winner really declared was that, they were a thing. Now, keep in mind, Sterling, this was a private company, and development of the Patchet was private. So not only were they courting the British government, they were also looking at other foreign governments, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, so on and so forth. So they were allowed to, and absolutely did, make for foreign samples. So you'll see small batches that would come out of Sterling in this era, going kind of here and there and getting evaluated. And this again gave the design time to mature and kind of perfect it. But then we get the Korean War. And finally, they realize they have to get serious. They don't have all that many. They only made a little over 500,000 of these. The older guns are not as safe as they need to be. They obviously saw service in Korea, but there are reports of accidents happening. So finally in 1951, they get serious.